Welcome to this episode of It's Time to Do Economics. Alright, what I want to take a look at right now is how countries can better themselves by specializing in their comparative advantage. And before we look at a problem like this, let's just refresh our memory about two terms. Let's look at absolute advantage. Absolute advantage. And let's take a look at comparative advantage. All right, absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is the country that uses the less amount of resources. Now remember, with absolute advantage, I want you to think of my wife. My wife has absolutely every advantage over me, which means she can do everything better. When looking at absolute advantage, one must remember that you can have many absolute advantages. So a country may be better at producing both products, but what I hope to show you in this video is that even if they specialize in one of them, they can better themselves. Okay, the second one is comparative advantage. And what you need to remember for comparative advantage is the lowest opportunity cost. And really the difference between absolute advantage and comparative advantage is comparative advantage, you can only have one. I think this is important. You can only have one comparative advantage. With absolute advantage, you can have many. So the goal of any country is to figure out what they have comparative advantage in, and then they should, and this is a key word, they should specialize. And specialize is very important because if you do something well, you want to be able to specialize in that. All right, let's take a look at an example here. So let's take a look at, we'll do England, and we'll do France. And the two products that we will be looking at is, let's take a look at, let's say, red coats. And let's do white flags. Now, I don't need to tell you who's going to have the comparative advantage in red coats and who's going to have the comparative advantage in white flags, but let's do the math just to make sure. So, we say England can produce, let's say, 6 red coats and 9 white flags, and France can produce 4 red coats and 8 white flags. Now, before we start here, what I want to do is I want to go over the steps at which you use to figure out a problem like this. So let me quick change colors here. Let's go red. Alright, so step number 1. Alright, and these are the steps to figuring out a problem like this. Number 1. Alright, you need to determine if it's an output or, well, let's just move this for a minute. Output or an input problem. Sorry, I'm not used to writing with this thing yet. Alright, so is it an output or is it an input? Now, to do that, alright, we have to go up here. We have to say, alright, is this a final good or is it something that goes into a final good? And when we look at red coats and white coats, we determine that this is an output problem. And this is important because if it's an input problem, we're going to do things a little differently. So number 1, you got to figure out, is an output input? And to do that, you just go to these goods and say, okay, is it an actual good or is it something that goes into making that good? Some of the some of the ones that would be considered input is probably hours. How many hours does it take to make a red coat versus a white flag? All right, that would make an input problem. All right, number 2, we need to figure out absolute advantage. Okay, we need to figure out who has absolute advantage. All right, so we take a look at England, we take a look at France. In absolute advantage, remember our definition, less amount of resources. So we said, okay, who uses the less amount of resource to produce good? Okay, you can see in an output problem, England can produce 6 and France can produce 4. Whereas in white flags, England can produce 9 and France can produce 8. So what this is telling us is England, okay, has absolute advantage in both. Okay, absolute advantage in both because they can produce more using less resources. Now, one would think, well, if England has absolute advantage, one would think they should just produce both of them and not even deal with France, but that's not the case. Okay, Adam Smith believed and is proven that if a country specializes in what they do well, so England either has to make red coats better or white flags better. So it's our job to determine which one England does better and which one France does better, and if they do the opposite, then they should trade. Okay, so our third step right here is we need to find then comparative advantage. Now before we go to comparative advantage here, let me just go back to this idea of output and input problem. Let's just say for a minute this was an input problem, that it took England 6 hours to make a unit of red coats and 9 hours, and France 4 hours and 8 hours. In this case right here, if it was an input problem, it's who's using the less amount of resources. And in this case, it would be France, because France only uses 4 hours to make red coats and 8 hours as compared to 6 and 9. So that's why it's so important that you diagnose whether it's an input or an output problem. Alright, so we go to comparative advantage. And the key to comparative advantage right here is the lowest opportunity cost. Now you can only have one of these. Alright, so we are going to start in a column. We are going to start and look at red coats. Now remember, this is an output problem. Okay, and the reason why I stress output or input is the O means something and the in means something. So since this is an output problem, we're going to take this 9 and we're going to put it over the 6. So what that means is that would be 3, 2, or since we don't like our third grade teacher, all right, that'd be 1.5. So let me explain what that 1.5 means. All right, so in order for England to make one red coat, it needs to give up 1.5 white flags. So that 1.5 is the opportunity cost of making one red coat. So now we go to here to France. We're going to be as an output problem. We bring the 8 over. All right, and what we see here is we see that the opportunity cost is 2. So what that means is in order for France to make one red coat, it needs to give up 2 white flags. Okay, so what we just did was we figured out the opportunity cost. We figured out the comparative advantage. We know that England only has to give up 1.5 white flags and France has to give up 2. So what we can say now safely, okay, is that England has the comparative advantage in red coats. That's what they do the best. All right, so now we're going to come over here to white flags. We're going to take the 6 and we're going to put it over the 9, which we're going to turn that into a fraction, which would be 0.6. We take the 4 and we put it over the 8. That's going to give us 0.5. So what that means is in order for, remember, we're in the white flag column here. In order for England, to produce one white flag, it needs to give up zero point 0.6 red coats. Remember, we're talking about the opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost is what a country gives up to produce something. So in order to make a white flag, England's giving up 0.6 of a red coat. All right, you can see France, to make a white flag, only has to give up 0.5 of a red coat. So in this case, you can see that France has the comparative advantage. So when looking at this, we see that England has the comparative advantage in red coats. France has the comparative advantage in white flags. So because their comparative advantage is different, that means that a trade could take place. All right, so the last step of any problem. So once again, before we go to the last step, remember, in this case right here, okay, England will export redcoats and import white flags. Okay, and that should make sense because, whoa, what's up with that? White flags. That should make sense because England's better at making red coats, so therefore they're going to produce it and they're just going to specialize in that. They're going to import white flags. Where France will export white flags because they are better at producing that, and they will import red coats. Okay, so we go to number 4 here, the last of the steps, and now we got to look at this thing called terms of trade. Okay, so when looking at a terms of trade, okay, basically what a terms of trade will look like here. Now let's go. I didn't leave myself a lot of space. Let's go over here to terms of trade. Okay, so we'll say terms of trade. Okay. So it will say one red coat for, let's move this back up here, one red coat for X amount of white flags. Now, whether you have to come up with your own terms of trade or the problem gives you a terms of trade, the easiest thing to do is this. Go to the column where the 1 is. So it says one red coat. So you're going to go to this column right here. Now immediately we are more interested in the country who is importing these goods, because we know that France, if they were to produce red coats, they would have to give up 2. So the key is this. France is not willing to trade if they have to give up more than 2 because they could do it themselves. So what you're going to do is you're going to take a look at the number in between this, any number in between or equal to. So for example, if it was one red coat for let's say 1.6 white flags. 1.6 is between this. And so France says, you know what, I'll do that. France is willing to do it because if they were doing it by themselves, they would have to give up 2. Now they only have to give up 1.6. But say, for example, it was one red coat for 3 white flags. France would say, no, I'm not doing that because I can do it myself and only lose 2. So the ideas of terms of trade is go to the column where you have the 1 and then pick a number that is equal to or between the 2 numbers. And that's how you establish the terms of trade. So let's just quickly review. Steps. Determine if it's an output or input problem. Are they actual goods? Are they inputs that go into goods? All right. Then be able to figure out the absolute advantage. If it's an output problem, the absolute advantage is going to be the highest one. If it's an input problem, it's going to be the lowest one. So once again, make sure that you diagnose whether it's an output or an input. Third, you figure out comparative advantage. Now, because this is an output problem, what we're going to do is we're going to take this 9 and we're going to put it over the 6. Over because of output. If it was an input problem, you put the 9 into the 6. And that's the significance of what diagnosing whether it's an output or input. You're going to figure out the comparative advantage, figure out who's producing what. In comparative advantage, you're always looking for the lowest number. Who has the lowest opportunity cost? Then you create your terms of trade, and there you have how to figure out if two countries should trade with themselves.